Okay, so these are allegedly my people. They have a problem with my white side. My white people often have a problem with my black side. So where do I fit? And no one has ever really been able to answer that question. But I think that's not a question we've been able to answer as a society, right? And why this is so important about creating a distinct space that's not defined by what you're not.
Hi, my name is Susan Dale, and you are watching the HaluHalo Mixtapes. This is a series in which we bring together a group of mixed race folk to discuss and unpack issues that impact us. This truly is for us, by us, creating our own space for real talk. So sit down and make yourself comfortable, because we're about to go in as we explore the subject of growing up mixed race and family.
So I'm Lucy, and I'm half Malaysian Chinese, half white British.
Okay, so my name is Nina, and my mix is, my mom is white Slovak, and my dad is black African from Guinea.
Sure, my name is Evelina, and I am half Russian, well, Russian-Ukrainian and half Kenyan.
I'm probably about like 18 months maybe. My brother, my mum, my dad, in front of the Eiffel Tower in a very nice little sunset setting. I think this was the first time we went to Paris. I like it because A, my dad looks sort of peak Jackie Chan in this photo. But B, I like looking back, and it's odd to see how we've kind of evolved over time. And just to have the whole family together so people can really see where we've come from.
The one time that my mom had this strange idea of like taking me to a professional photographer, and we did like a couple of really nice family photos together, so it just brings some nice memories from my childhood.
So this is a picture of me. I'm guessing I'm about sort of 1.5, and next to me is my cousin Max. We were inseparable when we were little. We saw each other every single day. He would also be the person who defended me against any bullies who took issue with the Brown situation. And we're still incredibly close, actually. So his son is now my godson, and he pretty much looks exactly the way my cousin looks in that photo. So it's sort of something that's still quite dear to me.
To start off with, I thought we'd take it back to childhood. Everything always begins there. Can you guys remember how old you were when you became conscious of being different?
So the first experience I remember, and this sounds really traumatizing and I don't remember it being this way, but I was in the playground, must have been about 5, 6, like at primary school, at infants, and this girl kind of pinning me up against a wall, which again sounds traumatizing, and saying, "What are you?" This sounds terrible, and I don't remember it that way. But personally, I was just confused. I was like, I knew I was half Chinese, but I knew my dad was from Malaysia, which confused me further because like couldn't reconcile those two things. And trying to articulate what I was to this girl, like kind of on the spot, and really it was just confusion. And I suppose that need to like defend what you are.
So it's interesting how like even at a young age, like kids kind of pick up on the differences.
Yeah. I had my first experience at a really similar age. It might have been even younger. And I remember this because, so I was at a kindergarten care group in Mariupol, and I was only one of 2 brown people, which made it a bit different. But we had a new sort of caretaker woman, and one of the things you're supposed to do is wash before you go to nap time. And she basically scrubbed my knees and elbows so hard I started crying. And then she got really upset with me, and my mom had to come in. And I was like, I don't understand. And she was explaining to my mother that my knees and elbows were filthy because they're darker than the rest of me, right? Because it's the whole melanin enrichment. So my knees obviously are a bit darker. Yeah. And my mom got so angry and explained to her. And I was like, so why do I have this problem and no one else has this problem? Because my family had never pointed out the whole brown skin thing. And she was like, oh, well, you know, your dad looks a bit different. And so your skin does different things. And I was like, oh, okay. And that was the first time I kind of realized that maybe I had to be treated a bit differently than other people.
Well, fortunately, I didn't come across adults like that. So, I was mostly like, you know, when I was walking on the street, people would stare at me or like always shout "black girl." That's why we grew up identifying as black, even though deep down I kind of questioned it, like, how about my white part? Because everybody was just referring to me as a black girl.
So I was wondering, growing up, did you ever find yourself in situations in which people, strangers, try to figure out your relationship with your family and your parents when you're out in public?
There was a hilarious time when I was at a parents' evening, and my friend came up to my mum and I was like, hi. She was obviously with her mum, and then my friend told me later they walked away, and then apparently her mum said, well, she must be adopted. And again, it took me by surprise, because again, I was not that aware of looking that different. Also, like, I think I have enough similarity to my mum that even if I do look sort of ethnically tinged, that you could see like the familial link.
But I remember walking around with my cousin once, and we stopped with this sort of old woman, and she's like, oh, so this is my sister, because typically in Russian you don't say cousin, and we're actually very close. And she looked at me and she's like, but she's all black. And the thing is, in Russian it's different. A black person is a Negro. Like, there's a different word. So black literally means the color black. So it's literally like she was stating the fact that, but like, what the hell? I remember being so hurt by that. And afterwards I walked off, she's like, oh, she's old, she doesn't know. I'm like, yeah, I know. But it's also like, can you not conceive of the idea of like family being not having to be ethnically and color homogenous? Again, I come from a small town, but that stuff is very jarring, because you understand it, but it's still like, but I grew up here, I was born here, and you reject me so like harshly. And she just stood there staring at me and just didn't say anything else. And I was like, wow. And I started speaking to her in Russian, and that sort of threw her off even more, because it's kind of like, it talks.
I was going to say, like, what the impact is growing up when you're in an environment which isn't diverse, which I'm presuming for you guys, definitely, in East European countries, it's predominantly white. What was that like for you growing up?
Do you know, it's funny, because I think my attitude towards racism was fundamentally different from a lot of people who've grown up in places like the US or the UK, maybe where there's more of a precedent and cultural footprint. Because for me, when I was little, I still remember times when sometimes it was positive, like people would stop their car in front of the playground where we were playing and ask to take a picture with me. Or sometimes it would be people throwing stones, being like, what is this, and all of this. But the difference was, like, quite often what would happen is that we go up country sometimes, and someone, you know, you're playing with the kids, and they're like, okay, so what are you? And like, can I touch your hair and this, that, which right now is such a political thing to do. But it really was the case of, I have literally never interacted with anybody who has your skin tone, your features. Can you explain to me how this came to be? And I think that kind of curiosity, which should be tempered with good manners, is fundamentally different to when I walk down the street and someone says black bitch. That's a bit different, right? So I think there's a nuance in terms of lack of diversity is more of a problem when there's this kind of other cultural baggage that comes in, where people start telling stories about what people like you mean, versus when people have zero context and they're just genuinely curious.
The times when I was growing up and now are, I think, very different. In the past, due to the influence of the old doctrine, because during communism the doctrine said that basically Soviet Union was a tolerant country, better than America, and that we should cooperate with other nations, some of whom were non-white, so for example Cuba and African countries. So I think that influenced the people's thinking back in the day, and also there was more restraint, general restraint. So race was a little bit like a taboo. People would feel uneasy about bringing it up.
Seems like a kind of facile point, but the fact that people can connect and you can form kind of communities online, I think it's just wouldn't have ever occurred to me as a child. And I think if I'd grown up with that kind of more immediately in this kind of community, for example, just like in my purview, then I would have started thinking of myself as mixed race much earlier. Whereas for a long time I could kind of remain, invisible and kind of just within that bubble that I existed in.
Actually, that's interesting what you were just raising, because I was going to ask you guys if you were brought up by your family in a colourblind mentality, or were you kind of given a racial identity?
My mum definitely thinks I'm white. and my brother, but like she definitely thinks we're white. She may even think my dad is white at this point. Like, no, genuinely, I just like I have asked her, and she's always intensely surprised if someone thinks that we look, my brother and I, Chinese in any way, because she's just like, you do? That's so funny. That's so funny because you don't feel like.
And does your dad have a different perspective?
I've never asked my dad, and he's never articulated it in the same way. But my mum is always just absolutely thinks it's hilarious. Is completely incredible at the idea that anyone could read my brother and I as anything other than white. And I do think we've just come from very sort of lower middle class white background. My granddad's from the kind of East End originally. My mum lived in quite a sheltered small town environment. And my dad kind of dropped into that. Like he had no other connections here. He literally came over to marry my mum. And so was sort of plonked into this little white setting. And so just got like assimilated within that. And then, so therefore it was natural for my brother and I to be brought up in that way as well. It's not like we didn't know we were Chinese. No. But it was very much, there was no emphasis put on it.
So did you not feel like you had exposure to the Chinese Malaysian culture when you were growing up?
No, and so there were passing kind of background references to it. And as I said, I was aware that I was half Chinese, but that really didn't mean anything substantive. We do a few things for Chinese New Year. I was aware that we ate some foods that were different to other kids. But beyond those kind of superficial things, I don't think I was really aware of of it in any meaningful sense.
In my case, I think both my parents, first of all, had to fight so hard to be together that they're very conscious around discussions about race. And so I was never told you're this or you're that. So I never felt much pressure to identify sort of as white, well, obviously don't have that option, can't check that box, but as mixed race or black. I got that pressure a lot from school when people are like, so what are you? So you listen to white music, so maybe you're a coconut, but this, that, the other. So to be honest, I only found that I had to figure out this whole, am I black? Or am I mixed? Or can I be both? When I came to the UK and people were like, especially romantic partners, I was like, so you're black, right? And I'm like, well, am I? I don't know. Like, what does that mean exactly? It's, I mean, I'm brown. I have no problem with that. But is that fair to then completely disregard all of my mother's heritage, right? So I think I only started figuring out that term when I came here to study in university. So.
Race was kind of a taboo in my family, so no, I didn't grow up with like any real identity. I say real because yes, I mean people would call me black, so I thought that I was black. I came to the UK just because of that, because I wanted to learn what is the black culture like, and also what is the mixed race culture like. I wanted to meet some people who have a similar story like me. I mean, I know some mixed race people in Czech Republic, and they were once having a conversation about this online in one of the groups for these people. And I remember one comment by a girl, and she said, sometimes I forget that I'm not white. And that is exactly our experience, because when we grow up in a white culture, well, in essence, you learn how to think, how to be like a white person.
Right.
You look differently, but inside, you really are white. And which causes a lot of interesting situations during your life later on.
And do you feel sort of being brought up with a mentality where it's not spoken about, your mix? Do you find that that's been ultimately damaging?
Not damaging, but as I said about the experience when I was little, it's just confusing. And certainly as I began to grow up and just look more visually East Asian, it was difficult to reconcile with this impression that I had of myself. As white, I remember people telling me that my dad had a Chinese accent and saying that I looked Chinese, and all these things just came out of nowhere for me. And it was a bit of an affront, which I imagine had I been assimilated to that earlier on, it wouldn't have been so confusing and such a shock. And I felt like at a later stage in my life, I ended up having this, muddled conversation with myself, rather than having had that conversation throughout my life and maybe having had it in a more kind of organic way.
When we moved to Kenya, I was about 7. And as I mentioned, sort of in kindergarten, you kind of have the usual stuff. People say things, but you disregard it. And I remember walking home, and the kids were throwing stones and calling me names because they thought that because I was half white, I thought I was better than them. So I was essentially running home, and I remember picking up this huge stick of thorns to defend myself and crying and getting back and thinking, okay, so these are allegedly my people. They have a problem with my white side. My white people often have a problem with my black side, so where do I fit? And no one has ever really been able to answer that question. But I think that's not a question we've been able to answer as a society, right? And why this is so important about creating a distinct space that's not defined by what you're not. And that's the biggest struggle for me, really.
Well, I'm a bit different because, I mean, I grew up like on a white planet where literally I was the only one. So I only interacted with the white side, which made it easier because white side said, okay, you're black, and there was nobody else to argue with that. So it was easier in that way. I think that this, you know, I was not that confused, unlike someone who has to deal with ignorance from both sides.
Do you feel growing now that you're older, your relationship with your mixed race identity has changed?
Absolutely. I think, I don't know why. As I was saying to you earlier, my brother has a very different outlook on this. But partly maybe exposure at university to kind of different kind of forms of like political thinking. But really it was more, I think, to reconcile with myself that I wasn't one or the other and that I shouldn't struggle to be. I think it is really a useful conversation to have with yourself, especially if you have been brought up in those very like particularised, localised settings where your peers are less diverse. Because I think realising that it is okay to be between two wholes is really, I think, a lesson we should all learn from, whether you're mixed race or not. That, you know, there are degrees of ambiguity throughout life, and to try and fit people into boxes is not not possible and therefore not satisfactory.
I wanted to get your perspective actually in regards to family, because I think sometimes there's this notion, if you're mixed race, your parents are completely woke. And I wanted to see what your relationships have been like with family members.
Man, there's an under-researched area, I think, of racist grandparents. Like racist grandparents of mixed race kids. My mum is really racist. She'd deny it to the hilt, but she is. As are my... I don't know, I mean, Chinese people are very racist as well. Chinese people are very xenophobic. My granddad is very racist. I mean, voted UKIP in council elections. I was in hospital with him once. He was just like having a checkup, and he just said, "Lucy, lots of Chinese people here." I was like,
right here, Granddad, yes. Right here.
Indeed. I don't think they were either. I think they were Filipino. But it is, again, I think that's partly the reason over time as I had to kind of confront the mixed race identity, because I was coming up against this whole side of my family that were explicitly racist.
But it's funny because I think a lot of, there's an assumption that mixed race people have it so easy and they don't experience hardships or prejudices. But I think what a lot of monoracial people don't realise is there's a lot of like internal personal relationships that are like a constant battle. Like if you're maybe a black person, you can sort of dismiss white people as, oh, they're like this and they're like that, and they only have to interact with them at work or in public spaces. But it's another thing when you're battling with someone who is your blood, like who can't seem to accept a certain side of you, and it might not be directed towards you because you're seen as an exception, or but they'll say, oh, you know, black people are like this, or and it's quite exhausting to sort of do the emotional labour
There's this thing around shame, which I think is quite unique to mixed race people, but I found that I had a lot of shame, and it actually took me, just coming back to this point of reconciling mixed race identity, until about 2 years ago to feel comfortable with it. Because every time I go back to Mariupol, where I'm much closer to the extended sort of family of my mum, I didn't realize how much I felt like I had to compensate for the fact that I was half black. Because the reality is, people would be like, well, you know, you're from a shithole country, like, you know, this, like, because the representation is, it's famine, it's underdeveloped, political issues, so half of you is really fucked up, but it's okay, because we love you. And this would be not just from family, and it's never conscious, and that's the thing that I stress, it's never a conscious thing, because there was so much love. But it was more of like, yeah, this other thing that you are, it's tough, isn't it? It's almost like, it's a disease that you have, but it's okay, because you're doing so well with it. And I actually struggled with that shame for a really long time growing up. I didn't realize how much of it had to do with completely unintended subliminal messaging around, oh, you know, you're really pretty, if only you were lighter, it would be better. But there's nothing you can do about that. Or like, oh, you're so smart. I mean, even though like all these Negroes do this and this and this, but look at you, you've done so well, right? And it's kind of like, oh, okay, thanks, right? But it's stuff like that. This is the thing, it's about people. It's never like, oh, our culture rejects you. It's more of like, if you live in a culture that's fundamentally racist, you're going to absorb all of this stuff and say things that seem to you completely reasonable. And like my cousin's husband still says the most ridiculous things and will like tell me about how inferior like brown people are and all of this stuff. And I'm like, but obviously your family is different and I love your dad. However, and I'm like, yeah. Sure, go for it. But before I'd feel apologetic and feel the need to defend that and be like, well, actually, and I'm like, but I don't need to dignify that with an answer, and that's okay. Like, it no longer feels like I personally have to be like, I must stand up for all the brown peoples and like, you know, legitimize our existence, right?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask if you had ever talked about mixed race or your experiences with your parents or with your family. Has that ever been something
I've had a few conversations, and I don't think my mum really understands it fully. The most acute thing that ever happened was I had an internship in the civil service before I actually started my job in the civil service. Had a meeting with the Home Office about sort of immigration, and it was just the core messaging, which is the government messaging, which is, you know, no unskilled labour from outside the EU, which it was at the time. And I just had this like existential crisis in the middle of this meeting, just like, oh, my dad wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be here. And I just got home and I cried to both my parents. And my mum, who, as I said, I do think is often can be very racist, but just said, I know it's horrible. And like, you know, we've got to stand up for these people because your dad wouldn't have been here. And I think that was the most kind of empathy I'd ever got out of her on race. But by and large, I find it difficult because I just think it's so beyond the horizon of thinking. And I think even for my dad as the kind of other in the relationship, again, like the idea of the mixed race and trying to carve out a space in the middle, is again, it's a tricky topic to negotiate.
I think it's very difficult, and I've had this conversation with other friends who are mixed race who have sort of a white parent, because they're trying so hard to love you and take care of you that it feels like a subtle indictment to say, well, actually, when you say you don't see race, you basically say you also, a lot of the pain that I feel is not legitimate. You don't see the structural discrimination that takes place against people of color. You're saying all of that is irrelevant because you don't see race. You may not consciously choose to act on that stuff, but our society is pretty much built around it. The triumph of multiculturalism isn't that we're all the same and you don't see difference. It's to embrace the difference and be comfortable with it.
My family have seen it as quite an affront to bring it up at all. So I'm trying to remember the way it was articulated, but I do seem to recall maybe it was my nan or granddad saying, well, Lucy sees herself as more Chinese now, doesn't she? Like, and it was a joke. Like, and I was like, no, I don't. But, you know, I've been put in such a context as to feel like I have to articulate it more strongly than I have done in the past because you've brought me up as white until now. And so, you know, here I am trying to carve out whatever this identity is, and not for any particular purpose, just for me to kind of understand myself and feel a bit more comfortable with this being in between. I think it's because they think it's an affront because like, you know, they are happy with the way they've raised me, and rightly so. It's not like they've raised me poorly, but there is some kind, they've done something wrong, and Lucy's trying to reject that now.
Yeah, but it's fascinating that you were describing the fact that your brother, who's the exact same mix, had the exact same upbringing, doesn't feel the need to push his identity as a mixed race person. It's not.
Yeah, and would really reject the idea of pushing it.
Yeah.
Lots of different factors, I suppose. I think just different personalities in the sense that I think he's probably less sensitive than I am. And he's a scientist, and I think they have, you know, a particular worldview, a black and white worldview. I do also think there's an aspect to being male and mixed race where you've got the male privilege added onto it, which helps you exist in some spaces in a way that's a little bit easier than if you're female and mixed race. And so that liminality isn't felt so acutely. But also, I have a tendency to think that maybe it's just something that he doesn't want to articulate because it is complicated and it's messy, and why have the conversation? Because, as I said, physicist, keep things simple.
This fetishization of children leads to a lot of unhappy childhoods, because what happens in Eastern Europe is that some white girls basically desire to have such a baby so much that they don't really look at the, you know, the character of a father, and they just jump into the relationships to have this beautiful baby. But then when the relationship doesn't work out and they're left alone, first of all they struggle as single mother, and then the child has to take all the, you know, prejudices, because this is one of them, isn't it, that mixed race family, dysfunctional, and the father is always like not present, and, you know, and the child has to then pay the price for that.
Talking of children, when you I don't know, if it might not be on the brain right now, but if you were to have kids, have you ever thought what it would be like to bring up, you know, because they will obviously be a mixed race kid no matter who you partner up with. Do you feel there's going to be, I know this sounds really bizarre, but just go with me. So sometimes there's an element where people feel like if they date or are having a child with someone who's white, obviously the child will come out more white passing, look less the ethnic side, and some people see that as diluting the culture or something like that.
I have thought about this a lot.
Have you? Okay, good. It's not just me. Okay,
not
great.
As someone who's like not interested in having children at the moment at all.
No, I'm with you.
But I have thought about it a lot, because I think about if I had a kid that was whiter than me, I feel like it would be a dilution. They wouldn't have this, like, if they had a white name, like, I mean, like, I've got fairly white, I'm Lucy Blim, but I mean, if they had a white surname, they wouldn't be identified as Asian. But I think what worries me about it, I suppose, is that I wouldn't know what their experience was like. I could raise a half Asian kid because I've now had that experience, and I could like navigate through that. I don't know what you do with a quarter Asian child. Like, they just white for all intents and purposes, and you just say, go off in your world as white now. And like,
it's because it's bizarre, because I know when I think about it, I automatically find myself wanting to be with a man of colour, to have a child that still has something that shows them as different, because I feel like I don't know if I can connect with a child who is going to have a more privilege than I will have experienced. And that's a really weird headspace to be in, because then I also think, how the fuck did my mum manage? Because I look nothing like her, but she loves me with all her heart. So why is this something that so plays on my mind as much?
That's very interesting.
Because you know what it's like. You know, your mom, she probably wouldn't imagine like the kind of situations that we find ourselves in. But as a person, you know, who has this first-hand experience, then you can tell like what sort of childhood might your child have, and you can imagine both the highs and the lows. Yeah, I mean, for me, I definitely would prefer to have a relationship with someone who is from the same background as me. Ideally black and white, and if the countries were the same, that would be ideal.
We need a special Tinder for that.
You've done it, you know what the narrative is. It's a difficult enough space to negotiate as it is. So if you've done it, like, you can just be like, I understand like the language at the very least. I've got the grammar right.
See, it's interesting because I actually feel quite differently. What scares me more is like having, this is sound like really weird, but having a black boy, because I'm like, it's so much harder to survive in that space, and society will, I know how society might see him, which is why I also refuse to live in the US, because I will never willingly reduce like the sort of life expectancy of my child. Like, how do you protect your child from all the stuff that you see? And if we feel it, imagine how much he's going to feel it down the line, right? Because it's going to compound, you know? So,
yeah. I get that, and I think that is the flip side to my thought process. Like, why would I want to bring in, if I had the opportunity, let's bring into the world a white kid who's going to have a great time. Like, exactly. it's going to be easier for them, isn't it? Like, surely. Like, maybe I'm being selfish, just wanting to like recreate an image of me. Like, exactly.
HaluHalo is all about starting conversations, and I hope this episode has started one for you or made you delve deeper. There is no universal way on how to be mixed race, and the views discussed on here are mine, Nina, Lucy and Evelina's truths. If you like this type of content, then drop us a comment, share with friends and follow us on Instagram. Your support allows us to keep sharing stories which deserve to be told. So stay tuned, because we have much more coming your way.